Welcome back to On the Same Page. We are on Daf Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph 37a of Maseches Kiddushin, and we're basically in the middle of the page where there's two dots. The Gemara quotes the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, "Chutz mina arla v'ha kilayim," except for arla and kilayim. The Mishnah had said that all the mitzvos, all the commandments that are, the way the Gemara ended up interpreting it, all the mitzvos that are related to the land, to the earth, so they only apply in the land of Israel, and mitzvos that are not dependent, they're not tluya ba'aretz, they're not mitzvos that engage in that are related to the earth, to the land, agricultural laws we could say, so rather they are mitzvos that are upon the person. Those apply both in Israel and outside of Israel. The Mishnah said, though, there's two exceptions. There's two mitzvos that are agricultural, that are related to the land, that apply even outside of Israel, and those two mitzvos are arla. Arla is the prohibition to eat from a fruit tree during the first 3 years of the tree's existence, and kilayim. Kilayim is to crossbreed different plants. That's also forbidden, and those two prohibitions apply both in Israel and outside of Israel. So, and then the Mishnah went on, and it said that Rabbi Eliezer Omer, af ha-chadash. Rabbi Eliezer says, even chadash. Even the prohibition of chadash. Chadash is that we're not allowed to eat from the new crop until the second day of Pesach when we bring the Karban Omer. Then we're allowed to eat from the new crop. Up till then we can only eat yashan. We can only eat from the crop that was from the previous year before Pesach. But once Pesach comes, then anything that grows after that cannot be consumed until the following Pesach when we bring the Karban Omer. That's of any of the grain, 5 grains, wheat, barley, etc. So Rabbi Eliezer said even chadash. Now, what does he mean even chadash? Even chadash what? Even chadash is allowed. Even chadash is prohibited outside of Israel. Even chadash is even chadash is forbidden inside of Israel. What did he mean? I guess that wouldn't be a choice. We'll see. The Gemara has two choices now of what maybe he meant. The Gemara asks, they ask them, Rabbi Eliezer lekula palig o lechumra palig. When Rabbi Eliezer comes and says, even chadash, even the prohibition of consuming the new grain, is he coming to add a kula, a leniency, or is he coming to add a stringency? How is that going to work? So it really depends what the Tanakama was saying about chadash. What was the first part of the Mishnah saying about chadash? It didn't say anything about chadash explicitly, but what to get hold about chadash, and then we can understand what Rabbi Eliezer was coming to say when he said even chadash. Even chadash what? So the two possibilities are either Rabbi Eliezer is adding a leniency or he's adding a stringency. First, we consider the side that gets a stringency. L'chumra palig v'hachi kamar. Is it that he's adding a stringency, and this is what is being v'hachi kamar tanakama? And this is what the first opinion of the Mishnah was saying. The first opinion said that all the mitzvos that are dependent on the land apply in Israel and outside of Israel, except chutz mina arla mina kalayim, except for arla. Again, arla is a prohibition to consume a fruit from a fruit tree in its first 3 years. Kilayim, crossbreeding plants. So all the Tanakama is saying all of the prohibitions that are the mitzvos that are land related are only in Israel, except for arla and kilayim. Those are both in Israel and outside of Israel. Because it's that's a halacha l'Moshe Misiyan. That's a tradition that those apply even outside of Israel. Now, afal gav dikul meimar chovas karkai, even though you would say, but they're land related, they're obligations on the land, yet they still apply outside of Israel. Aval chadash. But chadash, which is also related to the produce, can't consume from the new produce of the 5 grains. But aretzin b'chutz la'aretz lo. We would say that only applies in Eretz Yisrael, and not outside, just like all other agricultural laws. Now, why might we think otherwise? My taima. Why? Well, what's the reason, and what would we have thought otherwise? So, in the pasuk that deals with, in the verse that deals with chadash, the prohibition to eat from the new grain until you bring the Karban Omer, it says that this prohibition is, I'll get the exact language, B'chol moshvosechem, in all of your dwelling places. Now that sounds like, if it's in all of your dwelling places, that sounds like it should be both in Israel and outside of Israel. But the Tanakama we're suggesting now still held no, it only applies in Israel, even though it says B'chol moshvosechem in all your dwelling places. My taima, what's the reason? Because in Moshav, when it says in your dwelling places, it's not coming to say wherever you are. Rather, la'achar Yerusha v'yeshiva mashma. What it's coming to tell you is that it only applies after we've inherited the land and settled it. So that when the Jewish people first came to the land of Israel, led by Yoshua, and they were conquering the land for 14 years, so during that time, it wasn't yet settled, this prohibition did not come into effect. It's only b'chol moshvosechem. It's only when you're dwelling. Once you've conquered and settled, and now you're settled and dwelling in the land, then it applies. That's what the word moshvosechem is teaching you. That's one possibility. And if that's true, if the Tanakama held that chadash only applies in Israel and not outside of Israel, then when Rabbi Eliezer comes and says, Afa chadash, even chadash, he would be saying that actually chadash also applies, even chadash applies outside of Israel. The asur Rabbi Eliezer lameimar, and Rabbi Eliezer will be coming to say, Af chadash noheg bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. Chadash also applies both in Israel and outside of Israel. And that would mean he's coming for a chumrah, for a stringency. The Tanakama, the first opinion of the Mishnah, held that chadash, like all other agricultural laws except for Arla and Kilayim, chadash only applies in Israel, not outside of Israel. But it says b'chol moshvosechem in all your dwelling places. That just means once you're dwelling, once you've settled the land. And Rabbi Eliezer says no, even chadash applies outside of Israel, and b'chol moshvosechem means wherever you're living, this applies. That's one possibility. Says the Gemara, Dilma, or maybe Likula Paleg. Maybe no. Maybe he's coming as a leniency. V'hachi kamar Tanakama. This is what the Tanakama, the first opinion, held. Chutz mina arla v'akilayim. The Tanakama said that all the agricultural laws apply only in Israel, not outside of Israel, except for Arla and Kilayim. Because that's halacha Moshe Sinai. And the Tanakama held, the first opinion held, v'kol shekain chadash. And certainly all the more so chadash applies even outside of Israel. It doesn't even need to be said in the Mishnah. Dimoshav, kol makom shatim yoshvim mashma. Because it says b'chol moshvosechem, wherever you're dwelling, and that implies wherever you're dwelling, even outside of Israel. So maybe the Tanakama held that all the agricultural laws apply only in Israel, not outside of Israel, except for Arla and Kilayim. And chadash, even though they didn't say that, but obviously, all the more so. It says, b'chol moshvosechem, it says wherever you're dwelling. And then, so what's Rabbi Eliezer coming and saying, Af ha-chadash? V'asur Rabbi Eliezer l'meimar, and Rabbi Eliezer comes and says, even chadash, what does he mean, even chadash? Chadash eino nalig ala ba'aretz. He says, no. He's coming to say that chadash is only in Israel. Dimoshav l'achar Yerusha v'yeshiva mashma. Because that word, b'chol moshvosechem, in all your dwelling places, he would be saying means once you dwell, once you conquer and settle the land. So then what would he mean, even chadash? Umay af, what's the even? Akamaisa. He will be going back on the first thing, meaning the Tanakama said all the agricultural laws apply only in Israel, not outside of Israel. And then they say except for Arlo Kilayim and Chadash. And Rabbi Eliezer will be saying, no, even Chadash only applies in Israel and not outside of Israel. And he will be coming to give a kula, to give a leniency. So that's the Gemara's question. Rabbi Eliezer says even Chadash. What does he mean even Chadash? It's going to depend what the Tanakama held. If the Tanakama held that Chadash only applies in Israel and not outside of Israel, so then Rabbi Eliezer will be coming and saying even Chadash applies outside of Israel. But if the Tanakama was saying that all the agricultural laws apply only in Israel, not outside of Israel, except Kilayim, except for Arla, Kilayim, and Chadash, so then, when Rabbi Eliezer comes and says even Chadash, he would be saying even Chadash is only in Israel, not outside of Israel. He would be giving a leniency. So which one is it? Says the Gemara, Tashma, come and listen, De'amar Abaye. Abaye said a statement, and this will help us resolve our question. Abaye said, Man Tana de Polig Aleh de Rabbi Eliezer. Who is this Tana? Who is this Tanakama? Who's the author of the first part of the Mishnah? Abaye said Rabbi Yishmael. It's Rabbi Yishmael. How does he know it's Rabbi Yishmael? Ditanya, because we learned the following in a Brisa. Rabbi Yishmael said, L'lamedcha shekol makom shne'emar bo moshav eino elo la'achar Yerusha v'yeshiva divrei Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael said, he was talking about something else, which we'll explain in a moment. He's talking about nisachim, the libations for an offering. And in that context, it also says the word moshav seichem, your dwelling places. And Rabbi Yishmael said that whenever it says moshav, it doesn't mean wherever you're dwelling, anywhere in the world. It means, like our other possibility, it means after you've settled the land. So in this case, Rabbi Yishmael was talking about as I said, Nisachim. Rashi explains the whole thing. It's from Parsha Shlach. In Parsha Shlach, it says that when you come to the land, El Eretz Moshvo Seichem, when you come to the land of your dwelling place, and you bring a carbon, so you have to do Nisachim, you have to bring libations. Now, when they first entered the land of Israel, so it was kind of a unique period because you were allowed at that time to bring a carbon on your own bama, on your own altar that you would build in your backyard. That was only for the first period of time until they built the Mishkan in Shiloh. At that point, you were no longer allowed to bring your own carbon on your own bama, but up until that point you were allowed to. Now there was still a public bama, a public altar, which was in Gilgal, and later was moved to Shiloh. But, so that was where they brought the public offerings. The Kohanim still did their service and brought the public offerings. But an individual was allowed to bring a private offering. Now, when an individual brought a private offering, would they also do nisachim? Would they do libations of wine along with the offering, which is what was done on a public offering? Would an individual do that as well? So Rabbi Yishmael held no. Rabbi Yishmael held that it says in the pasuk, Asher ani nosein lachem, that I give to you in the plural. He understood that only when it's you in the plural, only when it's a public offering are there libations, but not if it's a private offering. Only on the bama, only on the altar, that's for lachem, that's for everybody. So therefore, Rabbi Yishmael held that individuals don't bring libations on their own altars, on their own private bamas. So when the pasuk says that when you come to the land of your dwelling place, Eretz Moshvo Seichem, the land of your dwelling place, you should do libations. So it can't mean wherever you happen to be dwelling, because you wouldn't do libations wherever you're dwelling. Rabbi Yishmael held you only do libations on the public Mizbeach, the Bama Gedola, the main altar of the Jewish people. So when it says Moshe Seichem, it can't mean wherever you are. So therefore, it must mean that Moshe Seichem must mean that you don't have to bring libations until after you've settled the land, even on the Bama Gedola, even on the public Bama, the public Mizbeach. You only when you come to the land that you're going to settle, then you should do libations. But you do not have to do libations on the offerings until after the land is settled. And that's for the public mizbeach, because you'd never do libations for private mizbeachs. That's how Rabbi Yishmael understood. And Rabbi Yishmael said from here that whenever it says Moshe Osechem, whenever it says your dwelling place, it means not wherever you happen to live, but rather it means after we've settled the land, then this law applies. So therefore, he was talking about it in a different context, in the context of Nisachim, of the libations. But he said this rule that wherever it says Moshe Osechem, it means after you've settled the land, and not that you just do it wherever you happen to be. So therefore, the Gemara is saying, based on this, that Abaye was saying that the Tana of our Mishnah is Rabbi Yishmael. Meaning the Tana Kama, the first opinion in our Mishnah, is the same Rabbi Yishmael, who holds that Moshe Osechem means after you settle the land. So therefore, what does our Tana Kama hold about Chadash, where it also says Moshe Osechem? Our Tana Kama would hold that Chadash applies only in the land of Israel. Oh, but it says Moshe Osechem. Doesn't that mean wherever you happen to be? B'chol Moshe Osechem, wherever you're dwelling? No. It means once you're dwelling, once you've settled the land, then this law applies. But still only in the land of Israel. And Rabbi Eliezer would be coming to argue on that and say, no, Moshe Osechem means wherever you're dwelling. And it's Afa Chadash, even Chadash is outside the land of Israel. Now within that brisa still, the Gemara goes on, it says, again, D'Tanya, we're learning a brisa l'lamedcha, the word Moshe Osechem, as interpreted by Rabbi Yishmael in the context of Nesachim, of libations, it teaches you, it's l'lamedcha, it's coming to teach you, shekol makom shneimar bo moshav, wherever it says moshav, eino elo la'achar yerusha v'yeshiva, always is coming to tell you not that it applies everywhere, wherever you're dwelling, but rather that it only applies after you dwell, after you settle the land. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael, that's the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. Amar lo Rabbi Akiva, so still in that brisa, Rabbi Akiva responded, Harei Shabbos, what about the mitzvah of Shabbos? Shenemar bo moshvos, it says by Shabbos, moshavos, it says your dwelling places. V'noheges bein ba'aretz, bein b'chutz la'aretz. And yet, that applies both in the land of Israel and outside the land of Israel. We know Shabbos applies everywhere. So Rabbi Yishmael, you're saying that when it says Moshavos, it means in the land of Israel, only once we've settled the land. But by Shabbos, it also says B'chol Moshe Osechem. And there, it can't mean only after you've settled the land and only in the land of Israel. Shabbos applies everywhere. So Rabbi Yishmael responded, Amar le, he said to him, Shabbos mikav v'chomer askia. Shabbos, we don't need, we know that it applies everywhere, not from the word Moshe Osechem. In other words, let me go back a step. Rabbi Akiva was arguing, we know Shabbos applies everywhere. How do we know it applies everywhere? We must know that from the word Moshe Osechem, which means wherever you're living. That's how we know that Shabbos applies everywhere. You, Rabbi Yishmael, were trying to tell me that Moshe Osechem just means after you settle the land. Rabbi Akiva says no. It says Moshe Osechem by Shabbos. We know that Shabbos applies everywhere. It must be because it says Moshe Osechem, wherever you're dwelling. That it applies wherever you happen to live. So he responds, Rabbi Yishmael responds, Shabbos mikav v'chomer asya. You know how I know that Shabbos applies everywhere? From a kav v'chomer. From an argument, a logical argument, a fortiori. Ma mitzvahs kalos. No hagos. Bein ba'aretz, bein b'chutz la'aretz. If lighter mitzvahs, meaning mitzvahs that don't bear as severe a punishment, apply both in the land of Israel and outside the land of Israel, Shabbos chamira lo kol shekain, Shabbos, which is much more stringent, Shabbos, which comes with very serious consequences for transgressing it, isn't it all the more so that would apply both in Israel and outside of Israel? It's a much more stringent mitzvah. That was the response of Rabbi Yishmael. And now the Gemara just ties it back, and it says, Mida Amar Abaye, but from the fact that Abaye said, Man Tana de Palgal Eder Rabbi Eliezer, that who is the Tana that argues on Rabbi Eliezer? In our Mishnah, our Mishnah where Rabbi Eliezer comes and says, even Chadash. Abai said, who's the Tana? Rabbi Shmuel. It's Rabbi Shmuel. So, and what does Rabbi Shmuel hold? Rabbi Shmuel holds that whenever it says Moshvo Seichem, it doesn't mean wherever you happen to be. It means after the land has been settled. So, Shema Mina, we can learn from here, Rabbi Eliezer l'chumra palig, that Rabbi Eliezer was coming as a stringency. Shema Mina, we can learn from here. In other words, now that Abaye comes and tells us, the author of the first part of our Mishnah is Rabbi Shmuel. And Rabbi Shmuel holds that when it says Moshvo Seichem, your dwelling places, it doesn't mean wherever you're dwelling, it means after you settle the land. So that would mean that Chadash is only forbidden in Israel and only after you settle the land. And along comes Rabbi Eliezer at the end of the Mishnah and says, no, Afa Chadash, even Chadash is forbidden outside the land of Israel. Which would mean that Rabbi Eliezer is coming l'chumra, he's coming as a stringency to say that not only does Arla and Kilayim apply outside of Israel, but even Chadash applies outside of Israel, because when it says Moshvo Seichem, it means wherever you're living. The Gemara says, Mechti. Hold on a second. Rabbi Shmuel Heichakai. What was Rabbi Shmuel going on? What laws was he talking about? Meaning the Brisa, the Gemara here kind of picks it up in the middle. L'lamedcha, to teach you. That's how it said. It didn't tell us where it was coming from. We filled it in with Rashi. But now the Gemara says, well, let's hold on a second. What was Rabbi Shmuel talking about? Anisachem. He was talking about the libations. B'nisachem, by the libations, bia umoshav ksivahu. It says both coming to the land and settling the land. So the Gemara is asking that Rabbi Shmuel seems to have laid out a rule that doesn't make sense. Rabbi Shmuel said, wherever it says Moshvo Seichem, it means after you have settled the land. That's an interesting rule, Rabbi Shmuel. Because the verse that you're learning from, it says, when you come to the land of your dwelling place. When you come to the land of your dwelling place. So I understand there, Rabbi Shmuel, that when it says when you come to the land of your dwelling place, it means when you come and conquer and settle the land, then Moshvo Seichem means that after you've settled the land. However, if it just says that the mitzvah applies b'chol Moshvo Seichem in all your dwelling places, then why would you think that has to do with only after you conquer the land? It doesn't say when you come to the land and conquer. It just says in your dwelling places. So how could Rabbi Shmuel lay out a rule that says whenever it says Moshvo Seichem, it means after you've conquered the land and settled the land? So the Gemara says, Hachi Kamer. Now this is what he was actually saying. Lilamed, it's to teach you. We learn from Nisachem Shekol Makom Shenemar Bia Umoshav Eno El Achri Yerusha V'Yeshiva Divrei Rabbi Shmuel. Settle down, basically. What he meant was that we can learn from the libations where it says when you come to the land of your dwelling place. And Rabbi Shmuel knew that there it can't mean wherever. It says when you come to the land of your dwelling place, you have to, and you bring karbonos, you bring offerings, you have to do libations. And Rabbi Shmuel knew it can't mean wherever you are because individuals don't do libations on their own bama, on their own backyard mizbeach. So what does it mean, Eretz Moshvo Seichem, the land of your dwelling place? It must mean after you've settled the land. So he learned from there, not that wherever it says Moshvo Seichem, Moshav, dwelling place, it means only after you've conquered and settled the land. But wherever it says when you come to the land of your settlement, then it means after you conquer and settle the land. Where it says Bia and Moshav. Now it happens to be that by Chadash, it also says Bia and Moshav. When it comes to Chadash, this prohibition of consuming the new grain, it also says when you come to the land and then it says the land in all your dwelling places, but it also says when you come to the land. So therefore his rule can still apply by Chadash, and you could still say by Chadash that it only applies in Israel, and it only applies once you have settled the land. That's Rabbi Shmuel can still maintain that. That's the opinion of the Tanna Kama, the way our Gemara is coming out. The Gemara asks, Ihachi, if that's so, if it's true that Rabbi Shmuel was only saying his rule about Moshav, that Moshav means after settlement of the land. That he was only saying it where it says when you come to the land, kisavo. So then, how do we understand Rabbi Akiva's response in the Brisa? In the Brisa, Rabbi Akiva responded, but what about Shabbos? Shabbos it says Moshe Vosechem, and it seems to mean wherever you are. Yeah, but Shabbos it doesn't say when you come to the land. If Rabbi Shmuel's rule is only when it says when you come to the land of your dwelling place, then it means after you settle the land. So what is Rabbi Akiva asking? Oh, but by Shabbos it says Moshe Vosechem, and there it apparently means wherever you dwell. It doesn't mean after you settle the land, it means wherever you dwell. All over the world it applies. But Rabbi Akiva, my rule is that when it says when you come to the land of your dwelling place, it doesn't say that by Shabbos, it just says in all your dwelling places. It doesn't say when you come to the land. So what's Rabbi Akiva arguing back from Shabbos? So that's what the Gemara asks. Ihachi, 3 lines down on Lamed Zayin on the base, 37b. Ihachi, if that's true, Amar lo Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva said to him, Hare Shabbos. Shabbos, Shneimar bo Moshavos. But Shabbos says Moshavos. It says dwelling places, and it clearly means all over the world, not just after you settle the land. The Amar le, and what does Rabbi Yishmael respond? He doesn't say, no, Rabbi Akiva, you totally missed the boat. You misunderstood what I was saying. He doesn't say that. He says, Shabbos kal v'chomer. He says, no, I have a kal v'chomer. That the reason why Shabbos applies everywhere is not because it says Moshe Vosechem, your dwelling places, but because of a kal v'chomer, because of a logical deduction. Nemalei, he should have said to him, Ana bia umoshav kamina. My rule was only, he should have said, my rule is only where it says when you come and settle. And by Shabbos it doesn't say that. So the Gemara answers, why didn't he respond to that way? Because chada va'od kama. Really, he was saying 1 plus. Certainly that was part of his response. But he had another response. Chada dana bio moshav kamina. First of all, you totally misunderstood me. This is what really Rabbi Shmuel was responding. He only mentioned the second part, but really he was saying, first of all, my rule is only when it says bia and Moshav. It says coming to the land and settling it. That's where it means that it only applies after it's settled, after the land is settled. And Shabbos doesn't say that, so Shabbos is just a totally different story. Shabbos won't be a question on my rule. Ve'od, and furthermore, dika marta, that which you say, Hare Shabbos shnemar bo Moshavos. You asked me, but Shabbos it says Moshavos, it says plural, it says that your dwelling places, and it seemingly means all over the world because Shabbos applies everywhere. So we see that Moshe Vosechem means in all your dwelling places, wherever they are. No, says Rabbi Shmuel, that's not where it's coming from. It's true Shabbos applies everywhere, but not because it says Moshavos. Shabbos kal v'chomer, Shabbos is a kal v'chomer. That's how we know that Shabbos applies everywhere, from a logical deduction using a kal v'chomer. The Gemara asks, B'mai kami palgi. What is this machokas? What's at the root of Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva's argument here? They're really arguing with regards to the nesachim, the libations, about whether when it says in the pasuk, Eretz Moshe Vosechem, to the land of your dwelling place, is it telling you that it only applies, Rabbi Shmuel says what it's telling you is that this mitzvah the libations only apply after you've settled the land. Rabbi Akiva is learning that it means that it applies wherever you are, that you have to do libations. So what is the root of their argument? The Gemara says, Rabbi Shmuel savar lo kirvu nesachim b'midbar, Rabbi Akiva savar kirvu nesachim b'midbar. The root of their argument are whether or not they actually did libations on the offerings in the desert. Rabbi Shmuel holds that they did not do libations on the offerings in the desert for individual offerings. They only did them for public offerings. So, they only did them for They only did them for... Now, in the Midbar, in the desert, we should remember, there was a central Mizbeach that everybody brought their karbanos on. Everybody brought their karbanos on the Mizbeach of the Mishkan. Their offerings there. Now, but there's different types of offerings. There's public offerings and there's private offerings. So, Rabbi Shmuel held public offerings had nesachim, had libations. Private offerings did not have libations in the desert. Rabbi Akiva held that, no, even the private offerings, if a person would bring a private offering in the desert, they would do libations, they would do nesachim. So therefore what? So therefore, what does this have to do with what's going on here? So now, the pasuk says, when you come to the land, you should bring libations. Right? You should do libations. So who is it talking to? So, according to Rabbi Akiva, they already did, when they were in the desert, they did libations already. Whether it was a private offering, whether it was a public offering. So, on the public Mizbeach. So when it says when you come to the land, you should do libations, who's it telling? Yeah, we were already doing libations in the Midbar. So Rabbi Akiva will say, it's talking to the individual and saying, now, for this period of time that we're conquering the land, there's going to be a special exception that a person's allowed to build their own Mizbeach, their own altar, and bring their own private karbanos. And it's coming to tell you that you do libations there. That even an individual at home, B'chol moshvosechem, right? Eretz moshvosechem, the land of your dwelling place, wherever you are, Rabbi Akiva says, you do libations. That's Rabbi Akiva. Because it's dependent on the fact that he held that they were already doing libations for individuals on the main Mizbeach, so it can't be coming to tell you that. It must be coming to tell you to do libations on your individual at-home backyard Mizbeach. But Rabbi Shmuel held that, no, in the Midbar, in the desert, they only did libations on the public offerings on the public Mizbeach. But on private offerings on the public Mizbeach in the Mishkan, they didn't do libations. So when it says, when you come to the land, you should do libations, it's coming to teach you that now that you're in the land of Israel, certainly at home, the private Mizbeachs, you don't do libations. That's Rabbi Shmuel's opinion. But once you settle the land, you're going to start to bring your private offerings on the central Mizbeach, wherever it might be, in Gilgal, in Shiloh, later in other places, eventually in the Beis HaMikdash. And it's coming to tell you that even though in the Midbar, in the desert, they did not do libations for private offerings, even on the public Mizbeach, but now when you come to the land of Israel, you will now start doing that. You will do libations even on the public Mizbeach. That is, according to Rabbi Shmuel, what is being taught in this parsha, in this section that deals with the libations. Okay, we'll continue here in Yirtzeh Hashem next time.